In the depths of an October night, a full autumn moon rises and hangs coldly in the still blackness of space. Yet, beneath this moon, curse plays itself out. A cycle of evil begins. A man becomes a murderous beast, and a monster walks among us. Blackwater Media presents Werewolf Halloween Horrors.
Sometimes in a person's life, there's an experience that is so frightening and traumatic that their entire concept of reality is changed, and so too is their view of their place in the larger order of things. In the mid-60s, my uncle was a deputy sheriff in a small town. Now, I don't want to reveal the location because of all of the self-styled investigators, thrill seekers, and so-called adventurers out there just waiting to pounce. Anyway, he'd locked up a drifter who he'd caught in the process of trying to steal a car. The stranger had been ranting about having to get out of town before nightfall. He was sure that the guy was most likely stoned out of his mind. That night, my uncle was driving back to the station just off his rounds. He noted what a crystal clear night it was, with the stars and an almost orange full moon lighting up the sky. He was only a block from the station when something impossible ran out in front of him. Some kind of creature. It had to be, but he recognized the blue shirt of the drifter. It was torn in 3 places. But the thing, hair covered its face. Its ears were long and pointed, and it flashed a mouth with insanely jagged pointed teeth. It stood there in the middle of the road, snarling, not like an animal, but like a madman, and illuminated by the police car headlights. My uncle jumped out of the car and got off 2 shots at it before it dashed off into the darkness. He was sure that he'd hit it, but it seemed unfazed aside from being jerked by the impact. He found the office in shambles and the cell door bars were bent wide open. He didn't know it at the time, but my uncle had an encounter with a werewolf and lived to tell the tale.
Do you believe that monsters are real? Do you understand that there's more to the world than what you might see on the History Channel or Animal Planet? Well, for me, the answer to all of the above is a resounding hell yes. And here's why. One night, just over a year ago, I was driving to the grocery store. But before I could get out of my neighborhood, I had to go around this roundabout. All of a sudden, I had to hit my brakes because a tall figure was crossing my path. It was walking right in front of my car, and then stopped and looked straight at me. I got a pretty good look at it, and to say that I was instantly scared shitless would be an understatement. This thing was covered with what looked like brown hair. Its face had a little less hair, and it had what I would call a short snout and a mouthful of sharp yellow teeth. And the eyes, god damn, those eyes were pure hot red. But yet, none of that shook me more than realizing that this creature was wearing a pair of ragged blue jeans. And I thought to myself, what the fuck? Then one word popped into my head. Werewolf. Then it started walking like a normal person. But then all of a sudden, it got down on 4 legs and took off running across the road. My eyes followed. About 20 yards away, it stopped right under a lone light pole, which afforded me another good look. It stood up again, looked in my direction, then turned and ran off into the darkness, this time on 2 legs. I whipped my car around the roundabout and drove back to my house. I looked at the dashboard clock. It was 10:30. I jumped out of the car, made it to the front door, and ran all the way upstairs to my brother. I told him what happened, and it's crazy, but he believed me. Next day, we went out to where I'd seen it, but we found no traces. I never saw the creature after that night, but for the next 2 nights, there were blood-chilling howls off in the distance. I realized later that on the night of my encounter, and the subsequent 2 nights, that the moon was full. And that, my friends, is why I know that monsters exist. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all once again into this rather dark and gloomy hall of the horrific. I'm your host. You might call me a master of the monstrous, or perhaps even a connoisseur of the creepy. Our tale deals with an old saying, confession is good for the soul. And if that is indeed true, it must apply even in the most bizarre of circumstances. Our story is called A Werewolf's Confession. And full moon notwithstanding, such a revelation can only be heard on the Nightfall radio show. So, here we are again. The holidays are upon us. All over town, the store windows are decorated in their usual Yuletide regalia. Houses are decorated. Street lamps are adorned with the festive decor of the season. We've even had a dusting of snow, with maybe another 2 or 3 inches yet to come. I think that by the time you hear this, the new year should be upon you. And yet, I sit here at my kitchen table, drinking whiskey in an attempt to silence a nightmare, trying to suppress a demon that rages inside of me. It's not stupid fucking holiday depression. It's not some unadmitted childhood angst. The fact is, I'm a murderer. No, I'm not some psycho killer with mutilated bodies in my basement. No, I'm not a coked out addict who isn't above killing just to get high. It's none of those things. But since I'm sure you're curious, I'll just tell you up front. And I don't give a fuck whether you believe it or not. You see, I'm cursed. I'm forsaken by man and God, whatever God is. But I'm sure that God is real. Because if a dark monstrosity like me exists, then certainly something of light and goodness must also exist. You see, I'm a werewolf. Yes, you heard me. Don't waste time trying to play it back to see if you heard it right. It happened 2 years ago, a hunting trip to Canada with a college friend. We lingered too long and let dark catch us. It came out of a thicket and knocked us senseless. It bit me on the arm. My friend fired at it, and it ran off into the darkness. A month later, under a full moon, I changed. I don't know how many people I've killed, but my blood-soaked clothes are proof enough of my effectiveness as a killer. The deaths are usually passed off as attacks by packs of wild dogs. The police know better, but they can't ever admit the truth. And I can't go on like this. The fear, the remorse, and the pain brought on when I change. It's fucking indescribable. The moon will be full tomorrow night, but it all ends tonight. You see, I have the cure. The only known cure. A silver bullet. All it'll take is this 145 caliber slug in the Nightmarians. My life, such as it is a small price to pay for the pain, suffering, and death that I've caused. So that's it. Whoever hears this, take it as a lesson. Or better yet, a warning. A warning about the reality of monsters and pure evil. Goodbye. And please, please, pray for my soul.
The curse of the werewolf that was laid on a baby who grew into a man possessed by a monster. To this Spanish town, the night brought drinking and dancing, music and girls, and the moon. The full moon that turned an innocent man into a savage beast. The curse of the werewolf, a man possessed by a desperate need for love, who found in Christina all the passionate sincerity of youth.
Christina, do you love me? Will you marry me, Christina? You say you love me, will you marry me?
Yes. Yes, I will.
Help me! Get away! Get away! Get away! No!
Come in, and welcome. As you may or may not be aware, you've just entered a three-dimensional nightmare from which you may never awaken. Tonight, we'll discuss a fascinating astronomical event, or more precisely, the horror that accompanies it. Our story is called Blood Moon Terror, and when you hear it, you'll pray for sunrise, which never really happens on the Nightfall radio show. Have you ever heard the term blood moon? Yeah, it sounds like a term that Rod Serling or Alfred Hitchcock made up. But it's really just a kind of non-scientific term for the moon's rusty colored hue when there's a total lunar eclipse. But for me, it will always be connected to the most terrifying experience of my life. I decided to get some decent pictures and went to a scheduled spot just outside of town.
And pulling into the area, I noticed a young tree had fallen by a nearby creek, right by where you could park your car near the bank to fish in the creek. I started setting up the scope and the camera, and I started to hear a lot of rustling in the brush. And since coyotes are common enough, I had my handgun on my hip, so I didn't pay it much mind. The rustling soon became more akin to something violently crashing through the woods. At this point, I stopped what I was doing and shined my flashlight around to try to see what it was. I figured maybe a cow or something from one of the nearby farms had gotten loose, but I couldn't see anything. Now, I was off-put by the sound, so I started to pack my stuff to leave, when I heard some splashing, followed by the sound of a very large crack. I turned and drew my gun while pointing my light at the fallen tree, and there it stood. Suddenly, everything kind of went into slow motion. This 7-foot-tall thing with what seemed to me at the time was the face of a wolf, but much too large to be a wolf or coyote. I'm a bit over 6 feet tall, and this thing was easily a head taller than me. As the light hit it, it paused, looked at me, growled, and then charged at me. I got off some shots in quick succession before it barreled into me, throwing me back and knocking me flat on my ass. Rather than follow through on with the attack, it kept running and disappeared into a cornfield. I got up and left the rest of my stuff and came back the next day to find a farmer, a couple of sheriffs, and a game warden. The farmer had sheep and a couple had been killed the night before, so he'd been driving around setting up trail cams and stumbled upon my stuff. The weird trail of smashed corn as well as some strange prints in the mud, and he called the game warden. I told him about what I saw and what happened to me, and they said it was probably a bear. Now, of course, I knew that was bullshit, but decided that it would probably be better not to make a big fuss about it. I looked online and read that people call this creature Dogman. Also, based on what I read, I was very lucky to get out of that situation alive. People need to understand these things are real, and they're out there. It's not a joke. It's not a game. Anytime you have an encounter with this creature, it's a matter of life and death. I live alone and have for 3 years since my divorce. And it's mostly been great to have my own space and my own house where I'm free to do whatever I want, whenever I want. That said, I spend most of my time in the evenings in my upstairs study reading, painting, writing, and listening to music. In the eyes of most people, I don't really have a social life, and that's okay with me. For the most part, I've never felt uneasy in my own house, until about a month ago when I went to the kitchen at night to make a drink. Now let me explain something to you. My kitchen overlooks an overgrown garden, which in turn overlooks some woods. It's a fairly rural area, and it's very quiet at night, which makes it a friendlier environment for some wildlife to come out. I often see foxes and deer, and I've been woken up at night by the scream of a fox at about 4 a.m. once. And they like to hang around outside the front of my house because there's easy access from there to my back garden and then to the woods. My kitchen has this big window which looks right into the garden. And at night when the lights are on, I can barely see more than a few feet ahead of the window as it acts sort of like a mirror. Well, on this particular night, the few feet ahead of me that I could see was all this thing needed to make itself visible to me. I hadn't noticed it until I looked up and out of the window after making my drink. It was a bipedal creature, skinny, but very tall with hind legs and covered with hair, except around the face. Now, it sounds ridiculous to some people, but the first thing that popped into my head when I saw it was werewolf. Its mouth or snout was protruded slightly, somewhat similar to a canine's, and it had ears that were pointed back at an angle from what I could see. And it just stayed there looking at me with two huge yellow eyes. His head was tilted to the side and its bottom jaw was slightly open. I didn't even know how long it'd been there. I'd been in the kitchen for about a minute before I even bothered to look out of the window. I just froze. You think you can rationalize what you do in situations like that? But I was fucking frozen in terror. I was telling myself to move, but my body felt icy cold. I couldn't do anything. Eventually, like after 10 seconds, although it felt much longer, I managed to move and ran out of the room, not daring to take my eyes off the creature. And as I did so, its head rotated to follow me as I left to the comfort of the upstairs, which was the creepiest thing about it. Since then, I've not gone into my kitchen at night, save for a few necessary occasions. I'm preparing everything I need before it gets dark, and then staying upstairs for the rest of the night. If I absolutely need to go into the kitchen, I rush in so I can get out ASAP. That feeling you get when you turn all the lights off before you have to go back upstairs and feel like you're going to be chased upstairs by some unknown entity? That's the feeling I get when I go into my kitchen at night. Last night I put a bullet into a man's head. I like to say it was right between the eyes, but I was off a little bit to the left. Now, before anybody gets crazy about what I just said, I need to include one mitigating fact. At the instant that I pulled the trigger, the man was in the form of a werewolf. My name is Owen. Twice before I've spoken to you about my work, particularly concerning the subject of vampires. From time to time, however, my exploits diverge off into other areas. Such was the case here. Last night was the culmination of a 6-month investigation that covered the distance of over 1,000 miles. I tracked the creature from town to town, down deserted highways, across rivers, through isolated forests and desolate swamps. There was a brief but volatile confrontation with the thing in the deep bayou region of Louisiana, where stories of the Rougarou persist till this day. Anyway, in the melee I was thrown to the ground and subsequently lost track of the creature, temporarily. If any of you remember, I spoke about vampires, about them being the result of a specific form of demonic possession. The same is true of the lycanthrope. I talked about how the truth about vampires has been twisted and distorted through the popular media. Well, you might not be surprised that the same thing has happened with respect to werewolves. Of course, I should state right here and for the record that yes, they are real. And yes, as I've said previously, The tetrahedral molecular structure of silver makes it deadly to the werewolf. I once spoke of the high vibratory frequency of silver. That specific frequency is 9.71 times 1015 hertz. Just as the radiating rays of sunlight disrupt the vampiric spirit's ability to maintain possession of a non-living body, so too does silver prohibit the emergence of the malevolent wolf spirit. The creature that I destroyed last night had been responsible for 11 deaths. I was brought into the case through the usual off-the-record communiques with high-ranking law enforcement officials. Each of the deaths were classified as mutilation murders, with all the victims having their throats ripped out as with sharp teeth, and severe lacerations randomly inflicted across the bodies. Aside from these factors, the attacks were all carried out during full moon cycles. It wasn't difficult to assess what I was going up against. But it's over now, at least this one particular case. But I do worry about any potential aftermath to what's happened here. I know about the associated deaths in the case, but what about someone who was attacked and survived? Perhaps you remember the legends? Well, this part of it happens to be true. To survive the bite of a werewolf is to have the mark of the beast placed upon you. And then you too will be a victim of the devil's curse. You're listening to the Blackwater Media Radio Network, the finest in digital audio entertainment. This is Blackwater Media coming to you from the great city of Atlanta. The story begins with a priest from a thriving village in Ireland who was traveling to a nearby town on business for his church. The priest's journey across the countryside was long and arduous, and as night grew near, he was forced to set up camp near a dark forest that was reputed to be haunted. During the night, the priest heard a clawing and scratching outside his tent. When he went outside to investigate, he was attacked by a wolf. He was bitten severely, and just as he thought the wolf was about to finish him off, the cross around his neck was exposed. The wolf suddenly ceased its attack and merely stood over him, staring into his eyes. Then, inexplicably, it ran off and left him lying on the ground, bleeding badly from his wounds. The next day he managed to crawl back to his village, where he was discovered by the local doctor. With good medical care, his wounds soon healed, and he was back to work in no time. The priest was re-energized and tackled his preaching duties with renewed vigor. He inspired the villagers and helped them to build a new church. The faith of his parishioners was strengthened, and every day his church was packed with worshipers. But there were still some problems in the village. Every full moon, someone in the village was found dead or went missing under mysterious circumstances. People said that they had seen a creature stalking through the village at night. A creature that walked like a man, but whose body was covered in fur and bore the head of a wolf. There was talk of a curse on the village, and many believed that a werewolf was stalking them and picking them off one by one. The priest began to wonder why God had cursed his village with these horrible murders. It seemed as if there was no end to the death and destruction. One night during a full moon, the villagers decided that they had to catch and kill the werewolf that was plaguing their village once and for all. They set a trap by tying the most beautiful girl in the village to a tree, using her as bait to lure the werewolf. High above in the branches of the tree, they rigged up a trap to catch the wolf. Then they hid in the bushes and lay in wait for their prey. Soon they heard a crashing sound coming through the forest, and suddenly the werewolf appeared in the clearing. As it made its way towards the terrified young girl, the villagers cut the ropes that were tied to the tree, and a huge cage crashed down on top of the wolf, trapping him behind its heavy iron bars. The jubilant villagers rushed out from their hiding places and drove long spears into the body of the werewolf, piercing its heart. As the monster collapsed on the floor of the cage, the people watched his hairy body ripple and change. Gradually, the creature changed from wolf to man as the life ebbed from his body. The villagers fell to their knees and began to weep as they realized that they had killed their beloved priest.
Listen to me, please, and be guided by these words. Listen well and heed the warnings that I bear witness to, for this horror is real. How Satan first came to intermix man and wolf and unleash the plague of lycanthropy upon the earth is lost in the mists of time. What is sure is that in doing so, he created a vile affliction that has contaminated many souls and caused much woe in the world. Any who suffer the ruinous misfortune of being bitten by a werewolf and who does not die of their wounds before the first following full moon will fall victim themselves to the curse. When first bitten, to all outward appearances, those who have become infected by lycanthropy are as normal men. However, when the moon is full, the contagion running through their veins takes hold, and they lose all control of their mind and body. An irresistible compulsion drives the lycanthrope to abandon his dwelling, and in the dead of night, find open ground. When the full moon light falls upon the creature, the transformation from man to beast takes hold. Once in lupine form, bloodlust overwhelms the lycanthrope, and it succumbs to the animal cravings for blood and violence that course through his being. The first few times that this change occurs, the slaughter of mere animals will suffice to sate his appetite. However, as time passes and the plague begins fully to infect his soul, such dull flesh as this will no longer satisfy his cravings, and the werewolf must seek out human victims. The more lunar cycles that pass before a lycanthrope is destroyed, the harder it becomes for them to maintain the semblance of human form. Eventually they succumb fully to the beast that lurks within and spend the rest of their days in wolf form, roaming the nights in an outrageous frenzy of bloodlust. Werewolves have the intelligence of man allied to the feral cunning and ferocity of a wolf. This makes them a dangerous foe to pursue. However, the flowers of the wolfsbane plant have a similar effect on them as the Holy Cross does upon vampires. To guard a dwelling against their entry, you should cover all entrances in an abundance of these pungent flowers. As you hunt their kind, a necklace of wolfsbane will afford you great protection. Know also that only weapons tipped with silver may harm a werewolf. Should you embark upon such a quest as this, remember my words, and may God go with you.
For the first 23 years of David Kessler's life, he was only human. Then one night he took a walk on the moors.
Beware the moonlights.
Is David behaving strangely?
Are you all right now?
Well, I'll let you know the next full moon.
Tomorrow night's the full moon. You're gonna change.
From the director of Animal House, A Different Kind of Animal, An American Werewolf in London. Rated R.
He has left his stamp on classic antiquity. He has trodden deep in the northern snows. He has ridden roughshod over the medievals and has howled amongst oriental sepulchres. He belonged to a bad breed, and we are quite content to be freed from him and his kindred, the vampire and the ghoul. Yet who knows? We may be a little too hasty in concluding that he is extinct. He still may prowl in Abyssinian forests, range still over Asiatic steppes, and be found howling dismally in some padded room of a Hanwell or Bedlam. Sabine Baring Gould, The Book of Werewolves, 1865. Flixton is a very small village about 5 miles south of Scarborough on the North Yorkshire coast in northern England. It's nestled on the southeastern edge of the Vale of Pickering, between the hills of the Yorkshire Wolds to the south and the edge of the North York Moors a few miles to the north. Today it's quite a bleak and desolate-looking landscape, elemental and rugged, with miles of swampy, open countryside. But long ago it was a dense forest with a large lake. It must have been quite a wild, remote spot in the 10th century, when the first known report of the Flixton werewolf tells of it terrorizing the local countryside. There is no way of knowing now just how far back the Flixton werewolf tales go, but in the year 940, the situation was such that a hostel was built in Flixton specifically for the protection of travelers. The werewolf had reportedly attacked sheep and local people as well as travelers. The winters at that time were recorded as being particularly cruel in northern Britain, and food was scarce. Freshly buried corpses were dug up and devoured, and anyone out after dark was risking being attacked. The Flixton werewolf became quite notorious around this time, not just around Flixton itself, but also in other local villages. However, the reports then stopped, and the werewolf doesn't seem to have been reported again for a couple of 100 years or so, when around the year 1150, the reports began again. It, even assuming it was the same creature, devoured a local shepherd and a young girl, as well as farm animals. This werewolf walked upright, carried a terrible odor, and had a particularly long tail and ferocious-looking eyes. Then all seems to have gone quiet again for about 600 years. Maybe we should pause here for a moment and consider the idea of lycanthropy, the ability to become a wolf or werewolf, as either as an inherited genetic trait or something which is learned and passed down through the generations, in particular families or groups, rather than a single creature wandering around for hundreds of years. Shape-shifting is an incredibly ancient phenomenon, reported from all parts of the world in all time periods, even hinted at as far back as the Paleolithic in Europe, where cave paintings show the possible transformation of humans into animals. Either way, it's difficult to imagine that a single creature could survive over a period of at least 1,000 years. One particularly interesting twist to the legend is that it is believed the werewolf was connected to a local magician who either used the creature for his own ends or was actually a shapeshifter himself, taking on the form of a wolf at will. Anyway, sometime around 1800, a carriage traveling to York was attacked just outside Flixton by a huge wolf-like creature who first attacked the driver and then the occupants of the carriage. One of the travelers reportedly shot the creature, but apparently he didn't use silver bullets because the creature was unharmed. It has to be remembered that wolves had been pretty well eradicated from that area by that time. And anyway, a solitary wolf would have been pretty desperate to attack a carriage full of people.
Moving ahead to the 20th century, starting in the 1970s, a local report said that a truck was attacked when a huge wolf-like creature jumped on the front and tried to bash its way through the windshield. Moving further forward in time to 2016, a story that may be relevant was widely reported in the media about a creature which was seen several times near Beverly, which lies just over the Yorkshire Wolds about 25 miles to the south of Flixton. There were at least 7 sightings reported over a short period of time of a creature described as half man and half dog, which stood upright on its hind legs, then dropped down and ran on all fours before jumping 30 feet over the Barmston drainage canal. It was reported to be at least 8 feet tall and covered in shaggy hair. There is a local legend dating back centuries of a creature called Old Stinker, which is also tall, hairy, and had red eyes. Whether this is connected to the Flixton werewolf legend is anyone's guess, but local people organized a werewolf hunt to try to find more evidence, presumably carrying the customarily expected pitchforks and burning torches. So the Flixton werewolf may be a flesh and blood creature, or local folklore, but whatever it is, it certainly hasn't gone away. Another point of interest is that Flixton is the site of Starcar, a Neolithic lake village which dates back to the end of the last ice age, and so is the first known site to be occupied after the glaciers retreated about 11,000 years ago. This gives the locale a very ancient history indeed, and is a perfect place for stories and legends to grow. And although the oldest reports of the werewolf at Flixton date back over 1,000 years, who knows whether people were telling tales of strange creatures there many thousands of years before that, way back in the mists of time. Thank you for listening to the Shadowland Radio Show. If you're listening on the Blackwater Media YouTube channel, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. You can also listen at blackwatermedia.net and the Blackwater Media Facebook page. I'm Dr. William Lester, and I promise to see each and every one of you again on the flip side. This is the first time I'm actually sharing this experience with anyone, and it's taken me quite a while to be able to tell it, because ever since it happened, I haven't been the same. I don't sleep as well, have constant nightmares, have been generally getting more ill and just being traumatized. My brother as well, with whom it occurred. Last summer, in July, I was visiting my brother, who happens to live in northern Michigan in a town called Rapid City. The place itself is pretty close to the Traverse State Forest area in which a long road runs through it called Supply Road. This road has thick forests and brush on both sides with occasional farms. We'd gone down south to Fife Lake, which is only about a 30-minute drive from where he lived. He wanted to show me around the area and the lake itself and have some fun with photography. It was about 9 p.m. when we finally decided to call it a day, and it was pretty dark at this point. On the way back, we were both like, fuck it, let's drive through the Traverse State Forest area for a more scenic route, even though it's out of the way. We both love the woods and going through scenic routes, and I love getting to see new parts of Michigan. As we pulled onto Supply Road, it didn't seem more than 7 or so minutes before we had our experience with whatever the hell it was we saw. Going north on this road, on the left side, is about 10 or so feet of clearing with just dirt and grass before it hits thick brush and trees. It was a little after 9 p.m. at this point, and as we were driving, I'm in the passenger seat, I noticed this large, black-like dog on the side of the road. But something wasn't right. It looked like it was crouched down as a human being would, waiting to jump out or something. It wasn't looking over in our direction, but you could tell its head was absolutely canine-like. As we got closer and the lights actually started to shine on it,
It immediately turned its head towards us and stood up as it made this horrible hissing-like sound. I don't know how else to describe it. Both my brother and I turned sheet white at this point. It slammed on our brakes. About 30 feet away from us on the side of the road standing was this, I don't even know what to call it. I want to say werewolf because that's the only thing that really described what it looked like. But then maybe it was a skinwalker. I don't know. This beast had piercing, sharp yellow eyes that for some reason didn't reflect at all when the light hit them. But they almost seemed to glow on their own, which was creepy in and of itself. The thing had a longer snout and very sharp pointed ears and was massively tall. When it hissed at us, you could see how sharp its massive teeth were and how fast it stood up and scared us both as we had startled this thing. The thing honestly looked like something out of a goddamn horror movie, and if CGI actually looked real. We had our windows rolled down all the way home, and we smelled what I can only describe as a mix of garbage, decaying flesh, and wet dog together. We didn't really smell it until after it stood up and we'd slammed on our brakes. This damn thing was about 8 or 9 feet tall, I would say, and had a humongous bill. Not bulky per se, but it was big and extremely lean. It looked like an extremely masculine and lean human male body, although I didn't see any genitalia. This thing was very shaggy and hairy, with finger-like claws, like pretty much you'd see in a typical werewolf movie. I didn't get a chance to stare at the feet or anything, as I was motionless staring at this thing. We only got to stare at it for what seemed like a few seconds before it let out this horrible scream that shook me and my brother to the core. It immediately started to pace towards our truck aggressively with its claws baring and teeth baring as if it were extremely aggressive and ready to kill me and my brother. We screamed at the top of our lungs and floored it as hard as we could. He literally sped all the way home, and we didn't say a word the rest of the way. We didn't sleep at all that night, and I haven't been the same person ever since. What I saw that night truly terrified me so badly, and I'm sharing this with people because I hope they can educate themselves and know what's out there, or that it will help someone speak up and share their experience and not worry about ridicule. The timber wolves around Harper's Creek had gotten out of hand. There were so many wolves, the farmers couldn't stop them from killing their cattle and sheep. So the state put a bounty on them. It would pay a hunter $10 for every wolf pelt he turned in. A butcher in town named Tom Wilson thought that was pretty good money, so he stopped working as a butcher and began killing wolves. He was quite a shot too. I mean, he was really good at it. Every year he killed over 500 of them. That came to more than $5,000, which was quite a bit of money in those days. After 4 or 5 years, Tom had killed so many wolves, there were hardly any left in that area. So he retired, and he vowed never to harm another wolf because wolves had made him rich. Then one day a farmer reported that a large black wolf had killed 2 of his sheep. He shot at it and even hit it, but the bullets didn't have any effect. Soon that wolf was seen all over the countryside, killing and running, sometimes, to the witness's horror, on 2 legs. That's when the talk of werewolves began, and this creature couldn't be stopped. One night, the creature even came onto Tom's property and killed one of his cows. You better believe that when that happened, Tom forgot about his decision to never harm another wolf. He went into town the next morning and bought a young lamb for bait. He took it into the hills and tied it to a tree. Then he backed off about 50 yards and sat down under another tree. With his gun in his lap, he waited. When Tom didn't come back, his friends started to look for him. and finally they found the lamb. It was still tied to a tree, hungry, but still alive. Then they found Tom. He was still sitting against the other tree, but he was dead. His throat had been torn open. But there was no sign of a struggle. His gun hadn't even been fired, and there were no tracks in the soil around him. As for the werewolf, it was never seen again in that region. But of course, this all happened more than 100 years ago. So my advice to you is to take special care on nights of the full moon.
A mother couldn't believe it.
Rich, stop this monster nonsense.
A father couldn't believe it.
Stop it, son. Killing isn't funny.
A sheriff couldn't believe it.
Doctor, that was no monster I killed out there. That was a man.
But your son cannot equate with your killing a man, so the man becomes a monster, and you, St. George, slaying the dragon. Devils, witches, werewolves have been with us throughout the ages. Children do actually see monsters.
A figment of a boy's imagination, or true.
We have a big problem with Richie. He's on that werewolf kick again.
There's only 3 ways that you can kill a werewolf.
Oh?
By being stuck through the heart, or by being bashed through the head with something made of silver, or with wolfbane.
Here's the rest of him.
Something must have come down out of the hill. Puma, bear, wolves maybe. When we found it this morning, one of the victim's head was missing.
God, that's awful.
Give us this demon and let us exorcise it.
It's true. Every word.
The areas in and around Columbus, Georgia have a rich history. And with this rich history, the city of Columbus is also home to a great number of ghost stories. The stories continue outside of the city limits in the surrounding communities. Those stories include one that is not a ghost story, but more of a legend that seems like something out of a late-night horror movie, and one of the most popular legends in the state of Georgia. And it has to do with a werewolf in neighboring Talbot County. Talbot County is a small community located to the east of Columbus. The county is home to a little more than 6,200 residents and a rather quiet place for the most part. One year, parts of the county were devastated when a powerful tornado tore through areas of the county, including the city of Talbotton. However, more than a century ago, a story came out of Talbot County that seems as though it was the inspiration for a nightmare. The Burt family was a very prominent and well-off family in Talbot County. The family had several children and lived in a home in the Pleasant Hill area located near Talbotton. The children included one daughter by the name of Emily Isabella Burt. Emily's father died at the age of 37, and her mother inherited the family's 300-acre estate. Shortly after the death of her father, Emily's mother sent her to boarding school in Paris. The legend says that while in Europe, Emily contracted lycanthropy, a supernatural transformation of a person into a wolf. Or to some, a mental disorder where a person has a delusion of being an animal, usually a wolf. After attending boarding school, Emily returned to Georgia. When she returned, her behavior was oddly different. People said that Emily was always sickly and distant. She often stared off into space and was known to sleepwalk. Shortly after her return to Talbot County, there was a rash of killing and slaughtering of wildlife, including sheep. Many of the residents believed that a wolf was to blame for those deaths. One night, local residents formed a posse and armed themselves to seek and hunt down the wolf responsible for the killings. According to the legend, an elderly man in the area who was a native of Eastern Europe told the members of the posse to melt down anything silver. They weren't dealing with a regular wolf. They were dealing with a werewolf. The posse, armed with their silver bullets, descended into the countryside, seeking the beast. The story says that one of the members of the posse came across the wolf, and it was indeed a werewolf. The hunter shot the werewolf, wounding it, and the wolf fled into the woods and escaped the posse. Oddly, the legend says that the next day, Emily's mother found her suffering from a gunshot wound. A local doctor treated Emily's wound, and shortly after, her mother sent her back to Europe for treatment of lycanthropy by a specialist. The legend says once Emily was shipped off to Europe, the killings of livestock stopped in Talbot County. After an undisclosed amount of time in Europe, Emily is said to have returned to Georgia and was cured of the disorder she suffered from. She lived her life out and became a respected member of the community and inherited the family property, which included land in Talbot, Muskogee, and Meriwether counties. Emily died on June 18, 1911, and was buried at a cemetery in Woodland, Georgia. She was 69 years old when she died. So we're left with a mystery. Did a werewolf haunt the hills and woodland areas around Columbus, Georgia? We'll never know for sure. But what if it was true? What if? Abizanda, Spain, September 29, 1992. We drove a few miles and parked at the crest of a bluff overlooking a series of mostly barren fields. There was little greenery save the occasional patch of scrub. The sun had already sunk beneath the rim of the world. My companion Sergio revealed from a case a 6.5 by 54 caliber Mannlicher Schnauer. Looking out across the landscape, he said to me, "Now we will wait." We waited there on the bluff for what seemed like hours, but I realized later that no more than 20 minutes had expired before the most horrific sound I had ever heard came rushing across the landscape. It was not exactly a howl, nor was it a scream. It was, upon reflection, a preternatural wail heralding the fulfillment of a curse. Sergio advised me to take my field glass and look to the left at about 75 yards. My field of vision was illuminated by an impossibly bright full moon. So was the view through the scope of Sergio's rifle. As the baneful wail began to echo down to nothing, I saw it. I saw it running at a tremendous speed. I could even make out the dust kicked up by clawed feet ripping across the ground. Although clearly inhuman, I could detect the vestiges of clothing, ripped, torn and flailing in the air, stirred by the motion of the thing. It took large, loping strides, and strangely, its arms barely moved, as if it were unnecessary for generating torque. It was at just that moment of my contemplation that Sergio fired a shot. The shot shook me to my core, yet I saw the bullet strike and take the thing to the ground. Then, to my horror, it rose again, in what were mere moments. I watched as it quickly resumed its surreal digitigrade loping across the dark landscape. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. That shot through the midsection would have killed any man ever born, and yet this monstrosity was knocked down by nothing more than the force of the bullet. Then Sergio fired again. The second shot struck the thing in the upper arm or shoulder, for I saw the ragged shirt flare upon impact and a patch of it blew off. The beast did not fall this time, but was pushed by the strike only momentarily before it continued its mad sprint. Sergio got off one more round before the thing finally dashed out of our field of vision. Again, that terrible wail exploded in the darkness all around us. I realized that we were now vulnerable to an attack from virtually any direction. Would the Wolfman seek escape, or, as I feared, seek to exact vengeance upon us? Certainly, if Sergio's rifle had failed to stop the beast, there was little hope of success in a hand-to-hand confrontation. In any other situation, we would have been more than a match for an assailant. I was 24 years old at the time. Although Sergio was 10 years my senior, we were both well over 6 feet tall and easily capable of giving a good account of ourselves. We agreed, however, with a glance and a nod, that indeed discretion was the better part of valor. As we headed back to the Jeep, I found myself muttering and musing aloud. What in God's name was that? And Sergio replied in a rare smattering of English. Nothing in God's name. That was the hombre lobo. We came to learn that the monstrous fiend that haunted the hills, woods, and quiet roads amongst the villages was a wolf man, a thing quite different from the so-called werewolf of legend. It was a man, cursed, possessed as it were by a bestial dark spirit that waged war with the soul of the man it sought to subdue and imprison. As such, the demon was brought to the fore when the forces of evil were at their strongest, especially in conjunction with the coming of the full moon. Unlike the natural wolf, the murderous abomination walked on 2 legs, at times even adorned the shredded remnants of the man's clothing. Strangely, until the time of the blood moon, the eyes retained a saddened human quality. We learned from the villagers that the burning of sulfur was prone to keeping away wolves. The scent permeated the air in the village square and the adjoining pathways. One night we ventured out against strenuous admonitions to investigate the strange happenings. This was the night that I was to experience the preternatural reality of the horror that has haunted me these many years. What I witnessed that night has never left me, and the nightmarish visage is a constant companion. It reminds me that at times, that the devil does indeed walk the earth. The following is an excerpt from the journal of Sergio Morales. Last night the thing appeared in the field below the village. The professor, too, witnessed the creature. I am sure now that he is convinced, as I have been for some time, that this was an unnatural thing. 3 times my rifle found its target, and yet the howling devil endures. I spoke today with Senor Abizanda and Sergeant Gomez. They have agreed to consult with the professor. Is it possible that together we can rid this village of its terrible curse? The body of night watchman Jose Mancilla was found inside his small 2-room office building on the morning of October 1st. He had been beaten and pummeled with unimaginable force. His face and throat had been ripped and torn as if by the claws of a raving beast. Abizanda was a small hamlet, and the word of the horror spread like the plague. Item: The previously installed security camera revealed a brief moment of the deed, but little more. The tape itself was viewed by local officials before being secreted away. Item: the killer was possessed of incredible strength. The metal door, locked and bolted from the inside, had been forcefully pulled from the hinges and slung 30 feet. Item: the momentary flash of activity revealed by the tape indicated that the killer was, in fact, the same impossible monstrosity recently witnessed by Sergio and myself dashing across the fields below the town. This is as much as I dare reveal to you here. Suffice it to say that such horrors exist in this world. Though I wish it were not so, failure to disclose the reality of such things would for me be the highest form of hypocrisy. I've seen it. I've witnessed it, and it has been like a plague of nightmares upon me since those long ago days. So what do you think? There may perhaps be as many reactions to this experience as ears that hear it. I am therefore quite content to leave the burden of final judgment to you. If what you've heard horrifies or shocks you, and has forever changed your concept of reality, allow me to offer you one small glint of relief. Tell yourself, as I have day after day, night after night, that it's only a story. If you can do that much, you can convince yourself that behind the safety of your door, in the quiet of your bed, that it couldn't happen here.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I offer you a warm and hearty welcome to this most unusual abode, which is neither warm nor populated by living things with beating hearts. I'd like to offer up a little something for your consideration: a full moon, an isolated farmhouse, and the terror experienced by one man when he discovers that some of the old legends are in fact true. Incidentally, this is the Nightfall radio show, and our story is called By the Light of an Ozark Moon. On summer nights, when the heat lay like a woolen blanket over the Ozark forests and wrapped the hills with humidity, Grandmammy would sit on the front porch where she smoked, staring out over the fertile valley and sloping fields that led to the river. If it was the dark of the moon, she would tell funny stories and laugh with us. A crescent or half moon filled her with nostalgia. Her tales on those nights came from her childhood, but it was different if the moon waxed full. A full moon above the woodland is a majestic sight. The moonlight silvered the tall trees and made the rocks shimmer with that almost ghostly light, but I never found it beautiful because a full moon upset my grandmother. She was a brave woman. I've seen her kill copperheads with nothing more than a large rock or the sharp edge of her hoe. I once watched a tornado dance a destructive path across the valley, uprooting trees in its wake, and she did not flinch nor even seek the safety of the root cellar. She feared little, but the full-bellied moon struck terror into her heart. I did not understand why, not for years, but I knew, as did we all, that on nights when the moon was full she would turn maudlin and might weep. On those nights, despite her fears, my grandfather would always leave. I thought he went coon hunting, a common enough pastime in the Ozark woods, until I was about 10. I noticed that he did not take the hounds, Lucky and Shep, along, nor did he take his gun, and his buddies did not come to meet him on the ridge. I asked just once where he went on those bright nights, but Grandmammy made me no answer, and I lacked the courage to ever ask again. Her eyes held such agony, her mouth twisted with distress, and I could not question her about Grandpa's whereabouts again. I was there on the farm, more often in summer than in winter, but I recall that on those December nights when the moon swelled full, that Grandmammy huddled in a corner of the large living room, the television turned low.
Although she stared straight ahead, she was not watching the fuzzy, snowy picture on the screen, nor was she gazing at the Christmas tree, a cedar cut down in the hills and carried in to be decorated with popcorn, paper garlands, and a tin-foil star. She always put me to bed earlier than usual on nights of the full moon, no matter how much I protested. In the summer, I lay awake long into the heated dusk and wondered where Grandpa went, but in winter, I curled beneath the quilts and slept, no matter how early she sent me upstairs. I may seem dense, but I never made the connection to the full moon and his absences. During the other moon cycles, he was a good grandfather. I toddled after him as he did his farm chores as soon as I could walk. He took me swimming on steamy summer afternoons down at the river, in the wide bend everyone called the swimming hole. I learned to float and later to swim there, in those cold, clear waters. On occasion, a snake might swim past, but I wasn't afraid. He loved homemade ice cream, Lucky Strike cigarettes, and wore faded denim overalls. He was a farmer who tended to his cows, a father who raised his 6 children with a firm hand and loving heart, a husband who provided for his bride for almost 70 years. And he was a werewolf. Saying the word, even now, is very difficult for me. It is hard for me to match the man I loved so dearly, a man I modeled my life after, with the wild, snarling beast he became when the moon grew full. I might never have believed it but for the thing that happened, what I saw myself, and what I experienced. I was no longer a child. I was a man, married with a 2-year-old son and another on the way. Although I was not a farmer by trade, I had become an officer of the law, a highway patrolman with the state police. I was building my life on the foundations Grandpa built for me. Although past 90, he was still alive, and so was Grandmammy. They still lived on the farm, although the cattle were sold, and the fields would have grown up into brush if my uncle had not run his small herd into their pastures. As often as I could, I gathered my wife, Trinity, my son, Chase, and we went to the farm. Sometimes it was just a weekend visit, a brief trip back home, but on more than one vacation, we headed for the farm. Trinity griped because the farm was and is isolated. The old farmhouse lacked air conditioning, but the breezes that blew up the narrow river valley had cooled it for generations. Chase followed Grandpa as I had, and I did what I could around the farm to keep things up, fixing a fence, painting trim, and such. That autumn, my wife was 5 months pregnant with our second child, and she didn't want to leave the city for the farm. I had promised my grandparents that I would come, promised Chase that he would pick up walnuts in the October days, so my son and I came alone to the farm. Always before, I had made good time on the long drive out of Kansas City, but that Friday night I was running late. Because of a major traffic accident on one of the highways that feed into the city, I was late leaving my shift. By the time I arrived home, Trinity had supper ready, and already more than a little mad about my planned weekend trip, insisted that we eat before we left. We ate, and then we jumped into my pickup truck, another thing in which I aped Grandpa, and headed south. Dark fell long before we reached the Ozark Hills, but I didn't mind. A full harvest moon, orange as the pumpkins we would carve at Halloween, rose and illuminated the highway. It lit the countryside that we traveled through, and as I came down the long drive that led through the fields to the farmhouse, it bathed everything with a rich light. I will admit that I had all but forgotten Grandmammy's strange preoccupation with the full moon. Somehow our visits had been through no design in other parts of the lunar cycle, and so I thought nothing of the full moon. I admired, in fact, how lovely the farm looked in that light, how the farmhouse rose from the earth like something out of a Currier and Ives print. Chase was asleep, snug in his car seat as I rolled my Silverado to a stop around the back of the house. Several of the downstairs windows were alight with a cheerful glow, and I didn't realize that anything was wrong until Grandmammy rushed out of the back door. "Henry's not back!" The words burst out of her throat. She did not bother with a greeting. Past 90, she moved with slow steps most of the time, but that night she moved with the speed and grace of a much younger woman. He went up into the woods 'fore dark, and he isn't back. You best get inside now. Worry crawled up the back of my neck. At 95, there were many things that could have happened to Grandpa, and none was very pleasant. As I mentally berated myself for not doing more to limit his activities around the farm, or urging them to move into the nearby town, I fumbled for the words. Let me carry Chase in and I'll go find him. I was not eager to go into the woods and search, but I saw no other alternative. Although I would be able to see with the moonlight in my service flashlight, I was worried about any lingering copperheads coiled on rocks to catch the fading warmth of the day. I was also, to be honest, afraid of what I might find. In my career, I've seen many dead bodies, most mangled in vehicle accidents, a few killed in cold-blooded murder. I'd faced death long ago, and while I didn't enjoy looking it in the eye, I really did not want to find my grandfather's body in the woods. I was about to suggest that we call for help from the local sheriff when Grandmammy spoke. No! That single word fell hard between us. No, Greg, you won't. You'll come in this house and we'll lock the door. You can't go after him, not now, not after dark has fallen. Although I had believed her to be of sound mind despite her advanced age, I wondered if I had been wrong. As I unstrapped my son from the car seat and carried him into the house, I questioned her. Don't you want me to go find him? He may be sick or hurt or... No. She shook her head back and forth with force. He may well be, but you can't go after him. Not until morning. But he might be... I didn't want to say the word. She had no such compunction. Dead? Yes, son, he might well be dead by then, but if you go now, you may be as well. He's not dead just yet. I wondered how she could know, or think she knew, but then I stopped halfway through the back door as a strange sound rippled the still night air. The howl sounded angry. It sounded almost human, and yet something like a wolf. Perplexed, I looked at my grandmother. She, frail and feeble, took my son from my arms and said, lips tight, I'll put the boy to bed and then I'll tell you what I should have told you before. I waited, uneasy, listening as her footsteps clumped up the stairs. I knew each creak of the floor, and it seemed like a very long time until she returned, winded. Her face had the harsh lines of a carved mask, something Native American, or even African. As she settled down into her old armchair, she reached for a cigarette. Grandmammy, you quit smoking years ago. I was shocked. She'd given up smoking after her 70th birthday. Her aged lips clamped tight on the unfiltered Lucky, and she lit it with a match. For what I have to tell you, Greg, I need a cigarette. You won't believe me, but please don't think I'm a crazy old woman. What I'm going to tell you is true. Her smoke made me cough as I asked, what is it? In her matter-of-fact, everyday tone, she said, Henry's a werewolf. Been one since he was a boy of 12. It's a secret I've carried for many years, and a secret I hoped never to tell anyone. I could not believe her. A werewolf? Please, I thought as I tried to banish the image of a late-night movie where an old gypsy woman warned a werewolf. Oh, Grandmammy. I thought I understood now. She had lost her mind, and I tried to find a plan that would both help her and find my grandfather. She shot me a look that curdled my heart, a hard, knowing look I'd never seen on her face before. I knew you wouldn't believe me, but it's so. I knew when I married him. He told me the night before we wed, but I loved Henry, and so I married him anyway. I moved here to this farm, and 'twas his own mother taught me what to do when the spells come on him. His daddy had made a place in a cave up on the hill, a place where Henry could go and shut himself into when the moon was full. When he was a little boy, they locked him in, but by the time I knew him, Henry put himself into the cave. At first, his daddy was the one to go let him out in the morning, but soon it was me. I've done it for all these years, rain or shine, wet or cold. I could not imagine that there was a cave on the farm. I knew, or thought I did, every foot of the woods and the farm. I played along, though, to buy time so that I could help my grandparents. Then he isn't locked up tonight? Her sigh echoed in the room, and she blew smoke out of both nostrils with a snort. No, he's getting slower these days, and he wasn't out of the yard yet when the moon rose. I ain't watched him turn in years, but I saw him tonight, changing from a man into a werewolf. If you don't believe me, his clothes lay on the ground out by the little barn. You heard him howl, same as me, didn't you? I was cold, colder than I'd ever been, and my hands trembled. She made it sound so possible, so plausible, but I couldn't admit the truth. I heard a coyote. It didn't sound like a coyote, though, but it must be. There were no such beings as werewolves, and if there were, Grandpa could not be one. Nope, you heard Henry. He's out there running wild in the woods, howling and doing God knows what. He may kill some stock, I hope no more than that, because he's a beast. A raging beast. No man can stop him tonight, not unless they have a silver bullet. I looked around the comfortable living room I knew so well, and it had not changed. The same vintage furniture, that hurricane lamp she had always had, and the prints on the wall had faded, but were the same I remembered from my childhood. Yet everything I knew and believed had changed, and I realized nothing would ever be the same again. In that moment, I felt out of kilter, so out of sync with life that I wanted to scream, to howl myself like an animal, and in that moment, I began to believe that perhaps my grandfather could be a werewolf after all. If someone stops him, won't they kill him? I had to know. Yes, but he may have to be stopped. I've always known that. 2 tears, one on each side of her face, rolled down toward her chin, and I wanted to cry myself. Grandmammy, I'm beginning to believe this crazy thing, I told her. But I have to know how he became a werewolf. She lit a second lucky strike from the end of the one she had smoked down to the butt. I asked myself years back. When Henry was a little boy, he liked to prowl the woods, sometimes at night. He come home one night saying a wolf bit him. That was around 1920. His folks cleaned the wound, washed it out with whiskey, and thought he would be fine. Biggest worry they had was rabies, but when the moon come full again, he turned into a werewolf. I listened, feeling like I must be having a nightmare, that I would wake up back in the townhouse with Trinity beside me. But the smell of the tobacco smoke, the feel of the rump-sprung couch under me screamed reality. It was true then, a terrible truth, and I wondered just why Grandmammy had told me. Then I realized that she had been worried about chasing me, afraid in case Grandpa roared out of the dark to bite us or even kill us. Her fear was born out of love. You were worried he might attack us, I said, hating each word as I forced it up my dry throat. We're safe now inside the house with you. And Grandpa, he'll be all right in the morning, won't he? I should have known that there would be more. Something else even more terrible than the bare knowledge that my beloved grandfather was a werewolf. But I did not, and I wasn't prepared. No, he won't, Grandmammy said. Another undulating howl outside, close enough to make the window glass tremble and raise the hair on the back of my neck. He would have been if he'd got to the cave in time, but since he ain't, he'll smell our blood. He'll come for us, Greg, unless you stop him. My mind froze, blanked out, and I stared at her, unable to comprehend what she asked me to do. When I understood, I began to shake, to tremble, and to feel a rising nausea twist my stomach into knots. My grandmother, a strong woman, who had succored me and given much to my raising, was asking me to kill my grandfather. If I hadn't already been certain, the sight of the single silver bullet she pulled from her pocket would have convinced me. I rebelled against the idea that I could kill the grandfather that I had loved, shoot him through the heart with this absurd silver bullet, and told her, I can't kill Grandpa. I can't. You've killed before,
Her tone was no nonsense and firm. And God help me, she was right. I'd shot 3 perps in my career. One, a drug-crazed man who threatened to kill his infant daughter. Another, a man who rushed me with a knife on a dark road. And the last, a young man who had shot the man who had hit his wife's car head-on and then turned to shoot me in his grief-induced insanity. Those deaths were in the line of duty. The dead were strangers. And I had shot to defend myself. Killing my grandfather was something quite different. I have, but it's different. Grandmammy rose, her aged bones creaking as she pulled herself upright. Her gnarled, worn fingers pushed the bullet into the palm of my hand and wrapped my reluctant fingers around it. No, it's not. He will kill me, kill you, and kill your son before he's done. The bloodlust is on him now, Greg, and he won't stop. He may be an old man in life, but he's powerful strong as a werewolf. Grandpa would want you to kill him before he hurt any of us. You know that, and if you don't, well, we talked about it some years ago. I can't. Even as I spoke, I realized that I could, that killing him would be as much an act of love as defense. I thought of my small son upstairs, his tender body that would crunch beneath the werewolf's fangs, and I steeled myself to do what must be done. Better to end Grandpa's long torture as a werewolf now than wait until one of us lay dead. Better to kill him before he might make my son another werewolf. My revolver is in the car, I said, my words choking up through repressed tears. I'll get it. Grandmammy nodded. Best load it right off in case you need it. 1,000 stars sparkled overhead, paled by the strong light of the full moon. I reached into the truck and grasped my weapon, chambered the silver bullet, and turned at the sound of something large running. I cannot call that thing Grandpa, came out of the woods. A tall, strong beast, at least 7 feet tall. Thick, coarse, dark brown hair covered the body. The mouth snarled at me, growling, and I saw the teeth, terrible fangs stained with rich red blood. As it jumped at me, lunged toward me, I aimed my weapon and fired 1 shot. I did not miss. I'm a noted sharpshooter, and the shot found its mark. At the moment of impact, the creature screamed, a horrible, anguished sound that made my blood run cold. Tears slicked my cheeks, and I realized that I cried out too. My wordless cry of grief, of pain, of terror came when the yellow eyes altered, shifted, and became my grandfather's familiar brown eyes. I watched as the fur faded, leaving a naked old man's body, gaunt and pitiful in the moonlight. He was dead, and the rest of the truth came to me then. I would answer for this in the bright light of day, for shooting my grandfather through the heart, and no one would ever believe what I knew was true. He was a werewolf.